Karoline stepped into the elegant restaurant, the scent of sizzling steak and freshly baked bread filling the air. She had been looking forward to this evening, a rare moment to unwind after weeks of relentless work. Dressed in a navy blue blazer and a cream-colored blouse, she exuded confidence as she approached the host stand. The restaurant was packed, voices overlapping in a murmur of laughter and conversation, silverware clinking against porcelain plates. She had barely given her name to the hostess when she noticed the sudden shift in energy, the way the woman's polite smile stiffened, her fingers tightening on the reservation book. A brief glance exchanged between the hostess and a sharply dressed manager confirmed her suspicions. Something was off. The manager, a middle-aged man with neatly combed salt-and-pepper hair, approached with an air of forced politeness, his smile as brittle as glass. "I'm sorry, Ms. Leavitt, but we won't be able to accommodate you tonight," he said, his voice smooth but firm. Karoline's brows furrowed. "That's odd. I made a reservation days ago." She glanced at the hostess, who quickly looked away, her cheeks coloring with discomfort. "Yes," the manager continued, his hands clasped. In front of him, "But we reserve the right to refuse service." A hush seemed to settle over the nearby tables. People weren't staring outright, but Karoline could feel their eyes flickering toward her, their curiosity palpable. Her heartbeat quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. "Is there a reason?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with steel. The manager hesitated for half a second, just long enough to confirm her suspicions. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. "We believe your presence would cause a disruption," he finally admitted, his gaze unwavering. The words sent a chill through her spine, not because they surprised her, but because they confirmed an unsettling reality. A quiet, disbelieving laugh escaped her lips. "A disruption?" she repeated, tilting her head slightly. "I came here for dinner, not to cause a scene." The manager's jaw tightened, his shoulders squaring. "Nonetheless, we must insist that you leave." He gestured subtly toward the door, as if encouraging a stray dog to move along. Karoline inhaled slowly, willing herself to stay composed despite the heat rising in her chest. A dozen responses burned on her tongue, but she knew better than to lash out. Not here, not now. Instead, she nodded once, curtly. Without another word, she turned on her heel and strode toward the exit, her pulse hammering in her ears. The cool night air hit her as she stepped outside, her breath clouding slightly in the crisp breeze. She could feel the adrenaline surging through her veins, the sting of humiliation mixing with something far more potent, determination. She wasn't going to let this slide, not this time. She pulled out her phone, her fingers moving swiftly as she typed. The city lights shimmered around her, reflecting off the sleek glass of the towering buildings. A taxi slowed near the curb, its headlights casting elongated shadows across the pavement. She wasn't going home, not yet. She had somewhere else to be, and what she did next would leave everyone speechless. The cold night air wrapped around Karoline like an unwelcome embrace as she stood on the sidewalk gripping her phone tightly. Her breath was steady, but inside a storm raged. The humiliation of being turned away, the veiled accusations in the manager's words, the way the hostess had shrunk under his authority. It all swirled in her mind like a whirlwind refusing to settle. She knew what this was. It wasn't about a reservation mix-up or an overbooked restaurant. It was a calculated move, a statement made without a single outright insult, and she wasn't going to let it slide. Her fingers moved quickly over the screen, typing out a message. It wasn't to a friend or an assistant. It was a note to herself, a reminder of the moment. Karoline knew she had choices in how she responded. She could make a scene, she could call out the injustice right here on the street, or she could play the long game. The long game always won. A gust of wind swept through the street, rustling the hem of her blazer as she finally lifted her head, eyes scanning the busy road. A few pedestrians hurried by, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phones. A couple, wrapped in coats and laughter, strolled past without noticing her. A taxi idled at the curb, its driver watching her expectantly through the rearview mirror. Karoline took a breath and stepped forward, opening the door and sliding into the back seat. "Where to?" the driver asked, his voice gruff but polite. She hesitated for only a second before giving him an address. It wasn't her apartment, nor was it an office. It was somewhere much more significant. As the cab pulled away from the curb, she leaned back against the worn leather seat, her mind already racing ahead to what she would do next. The city blurred past in streaks of yellow streetlights and neon reflections in rain-speckled windows. Karoline barely noticed. She was already crafting her response, already planning her next steps. She wasn't the type to cower in the face of adversity. If anything, she thrived in it. The rejection at the restaurant was meant to put her in her place, to remind her that power wasn't always about title or influence. It was about who held the keys, who controlled the gate. But they had underestimated her. The cab slowed as they reached the destination, a sleek building with tinted windows and a revolving glass door. She paid the driver, stepping out onto the pavement with renewed purpose. The wind had picked up, tugging at her hair as she walked toward the entrance. Inside, the lobby was warm, bright, and buzzing with quiet conversations. A security guard glanced up from his post, nodding in recognition as she passed. She rode the elevator in silence, watching the numbers climb higher. Her reflection in the polished steel doors stared back at her, eyes sharp, jaw set. When the elevator chimed softly and the doors slid open, she stepped out into a space that was both familiar and charged with significance. A long floor-to-ceiling window framed the city skyline, and the soft hum of distant traffic filled the otherwise quiet room. Karoline approached the desk, where a woman sat typing on a sleek laptop. The woman looked up, her surprise barely masked. "Ms. Leavitt, I wasn't expecting you tonight." Karoline offered a small, knowing smile. "Change of plans." The woman hesitated, then gave a quick nod, tapping a few keys before gesturing toward a door at the end of the hall. "They're in a meeting, but I'll go in," Karoline interrupted gently, already moving. She pushed open the door without waiting for permission. Inside, the room was bathed in warm light, a modern conference space with a long table at its center. Several people sat around it, their expressions shifting from surprise to curiosity as they registered her presence. A man in a tailored suit leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest. "Karoline," he said smoothly, as if her presence was expected all along. "What brings you here?" She closed the door behind her and stepped forward. The weight of the night, of the rejection, of the unspoken message behind it all, settled into her bones. But so did her resolve. "I think it's time we had a conversation," she said, her voice even, controlled, unshaken. The room fell silent, and just like that, the game had changed. The silence in the room stretched for just a beat too long, the kind that wasn't just an absence of sound, but a careful calculation, a silent negotiation of power. The air was thick with an unspoken challenge, and Karoline could feel the weight of a dozen unasked questions pressing against her as she moved further into the room. She didn't rush. She didn't waver. She walked with purpose, her heels tapping lightly against the polished floor, her expression composed, unreadable. She wasn't here to beg for explanations or demand an apology. She was here to remind them, whoever they were, that she wasn't someone to be dismissed. The man who had spoken, tall, broad-shouldered, with graying temples that only added to his air of authority, didn't look away. His lips curved just slightly, a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was studying her as much as she was studying him. She had known she'd find him here. The others at the table shifted in their seats, exchanging glances, waiting to see how this would play out. Some looked indifferent, some curious. A few were wary. Karoline knew most of their faces. Some were political strategists, some business elites, and a few were media power players who had no doubt already heard about what had happened at the restaurant tonight. The news traveled fast in their world. Karoline slid into an empty chair at the table, setting her phone down beside her with deliberate ease. She folded her hands in her lap and lifted her gaze to meet his. "You didn't answer my question," she said finally, her voice as smooth as glass but with an undeniable edge. The man leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table, his fingers laced together. "Which question is that?" She allowed herself a small, knowing smile. "What brings me here?" A quiet chuckle escaped him, low and measured, as if he genuinely appreciated the fact that she was here at all. "You tell me." Karoline exhaled slowly, letting the tension build just enough before she spoke again. "I assume you already know what happened tonight." Someone near the end of the table shifted uncomfortably. Another cleared his throat. No one denied it. The man across from her, she had dealt with him before, danced this dance more times than she could count. Didn't blink. "I might have heard something," he admitted, his tone casual, but Karoline wasn't fooled. She tilted her head slightly. "Then you already know that I'm not going to let it slide." A flicker of amusement passed through his eyes. "No, I don't imagine you would." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The energy in the room shifted. No longer just curiosity, but an underlying current of anticipation. Karoline could feel the invisible lines being drawn, the silent battle lines forming in the space between them. She wasn't naive. She knew exactly how this world worked, knew that power wasn't just about who held the official title or who had the biggest platform. It was about influence, about networks, about who could make or break someone with a single well-placed whisper. She had spent years navigating these waters, learning how to swim with the sharks without becoming their prey. And tonight had been a move, an attempt to remind her of her place, to test whether she would back down. She wouldn't. "Tell me," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Whose idea was it?" A murmur swept through the room, so subtle it was almost imperceptible. The man across from her, one of the few people in this world who could claim to be untouchable, simply raised an eyebrow. "Does it matter?" Karoline smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "It does to me." Another beat of silence. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair, as if conceding something, though she knew better than to think it was a victory. "Not yet." "All right," he said finally, tilting his head in a way that almost seemed approving. "You want a name? Fine. But first, tell me, what exactly do you plan to do about it?" Karoline held his gaze, unwavering. The answer was already forming in her mind, clear as day. She had known the moment she walked into that restaurant. The second she was turned away with an excuse so thin it barely held its shape. She wasn't just going to respond. She was going to make sure that by the time she was finished, they would never try to pull a stunt like this again. She wasn't just playing their game. She was about to rewrite the rules entirely. Karoline sat back in her chair, fingers brushing lightly against the polished wood of the conference table. The weight of the man's question hung between them, thick as smoke. He was testing her, waiting to see if she would flinch, if she had come here out of anger alone, or if she had something more. But she didn't flinch. She never did. She let a pause settle, just long enough to let them wonder. The others around the table were still watching, some feigning indifference, others outright curious. The political strategist, 3 seats down, had his arms crossed, his expression neutral but too focused for someone who wasn't invested. The woman near the end of the table, Someone Karoline recognized from a few high-profile media deals was pretending to check her phone but hadn't scrolled in minutes. Everyone in this room understood that moments like these weren't just about words. They were about positioning, about signaling strength, about proving that you weren't just another piece on the board. You were the one moving them. Finally, she exhaled, slow and controlled. "You want to know what I plan to do?" she said, tilting her head slightly. The man across from her, Nicholas, that was his name, Nicholas Warren. He was one of those men whose influence was never written about outright, but whose presence was felt everywhere. If you wanted a political narrative pushed, if you wanted a rival buried under a tidal wave of bad press, if you wanted the doors of power to open or slam shut, he was the one who whispered to the people who made it happen. Nicholas smiled faintly as if indulging her. "That is what I asked." Karoline let a small smirk tug at the corner of her lips. "Good. Because I don't believe in wasted words." She reached for her phone, tapping the screen once. The glow illuminated her face for a second before she set it back down on the table, screen facing up. A news alert was already waiting. She had set it up before she even stepped into the building. The headline was brutal. High-profile political figure denied service, a coordinated effort to silence. The article beneath it wasn't just speculation. It was sourced. It was thorough. And it had dropped precisely 30 seconds ago. Nicholas's gaze flicked to the screen just for a second before returning to her. He wasn't surprised, not entirely. He had expected a counter, but he hadn't expected it to already be in motion before she even walked through the door. Karoline leaned forward, resting her elbows lightly on the table. "You see, Nicholas, you made a mistake," she said, her voice soft but sharp. "You assumed this would be something I'd react to after the fact, that I'd spend the next 24 hours scrambling, trying to figure out how to handle the damage." She watched as he sat a little straighter. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but she caught it. "I don't scramble," she continued, "and I don't react. I prepare." The others in the room were no longer feigning disinterest. The woman with the phone was now openly reading the article, her lips slightly parted. The political strategist looked impressed, despite himself. Even the ones who had been on Nicholas's side from the beginning were suddenly aware that the balance had shifted. Nicholas exhaled slowly, a faint laugh under his breath. "Well played." Karoline tilted her head. "You sound almost impressed." "Oh, I am." He nodded, tapping a single finger against the table. "But I'm also curious. What's your next move?" She could have stopped there. She could have let the article do its work, let the pressure build on its own. But Karoline had never been the type to let others dictate the pacing of the game. So she leaned back in her chair, stretching the moment just a little longer before she spoke. "This is only the beginning," she said, her voice carrying through the room with quiet certainty. "By tomorrow morning there will be follow-ups. People will start asking questions, not just about the restaurant, but about why it happened, who was behind it. And once those questions start, they won't stop." Nicholas listened, his expression giving nothing away. But she knew him well, enough to recognize that he was already running calculations in his mind, weighing the risk, considering his own counters. She met his gaze, unwavering. "And then," she continued, "then I make sure the next story isn't about me at all. It's about you." For the first time that night, she saw it, a flicker of something sharp in his eyes. Not fear, not yet, but recognition. Karoline smiled, slow and deliberate. "So tell me, Nicholas," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Are you sure you want to keep playing?" The room was silent. And for the first time since she had walked through that door, Nicholas had no immediate response. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of the moment. Karoline could see it in Nicholas's eyes. That brief flicker of calculation, the rapid assessment of risk versus reward. He was a master of control, a man who rarely found himself on the defensive, and yet here he was, sitting across from her, forced to consider his next move carefully. She let him sit in it, let him feel the shift of power as it settled in her favor. Around the room, the others were watching with rapt attention, their allegiances hanging in the balance. They weren't just here for the conversation. They were here to see who would walk away with the upper hand, and Karoline had no intention of leaving without it. Nicholas finally exhaled, a slow, measured breath as he leaned back in his chair. "You've certainly been busy," he murmured, his voice carrying the kind of begrudging respect that only came when someone realized they'd underestimated their opponent. Karoline offered a small, knowing smile. "I always am." His fingers drummed idly against the table, his mind undoubtedly running through a dozen different counterplays. She knew his type well. Men like him didn't back down easily. They didn't like being forced into corners. But they also didn't like losing, and Karoline had just laid out the stakes in a way that made retreat the smarter option. Finally, he nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of the new reality between them. "All right," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "You've made your point." She arched an eyebrow. "Have I?" A soft chuckle escaped him, but there was no humor in it. "Don't push it, Karoline." She tilted her head slightly, considering him. "Oh, I'm not pushing. I'm just making sure we understand each other." He studied her for a long moment, then sighed, shaking his head. "Fine. Consider it handled." The words were spoken with casual ease, but Karoline knew better than to take them at face value. "Handled how?" she asked, her voice smooth but firm. Nicholas smirked. "You'll see." It wasn't a real answer, but it was enough. For now. She held his gaze a moment longer before finally rising from her chair. Around the table, the others shifted slightly, some exchanging glances, some still pretending they weren't utterly engrossed in what had just happened. Karoline smoothed out the front of her blazer, picked up her phone, and slid it into her pocket. "I'll be expecting an update," she said, her voice even. Nicholas gave her a long, assessing look before nodding once. "You'll get one." Satisfied, she turned and walked toward the door. The heels of her shoes clicked against the polished floor, each step deliberate, controlled. She didn't glance back. She didn't need to. She had already won this round. As she stepped out of the room, the cool air of the hallway felt sharp against her skin, cutting through the adrenaline that still hummed in her veins. She exhaled, steadying herself. She had walked into that room prepared for a fight, and she had walked out with exactly what she wanted, but she wasn't naive enough to think this was over. She pulled her phone from her pocket as she strode toward the elevator. The article had already begun circulating widely. Social media was ablaze with speculation. The restaurant was scrambling to issue a statement, but it was too late. The narrative had taken shape, and it was no longer theirs to. Controlled at a notification popped up, an incoming message, unknown number. That was bold. Karoline smirked as she stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. She typed a quick response. "Karoline, I don't play small." The doors slid shut, and as the elevator began its descent, she was already thinking, 10 moves ahead. The elevator descended smoothly, its soft mechanical hum the only sound filling the quiet space. Karoline's reflection stared back at her in the polished steel doors, composed, unshaken, but behind her calm expression the fire still burned. This wasn't over, not even close. Her phone buzzed again in her palm. Another message. "Unknown number. No, you don't. But are you ready for what comes next?" She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let the question hang in her mind, let herself feel the weight of it. Was she ready? That wasn't the right question. The real question was, were they? The elevator doors slid open, revealing the sleek, modern lobby. A few people lingered near the front desk, their hushed conversations buzzing through the open space. Karoline walked with purpose, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She had no intention of lingering. She had work to do. As she stepped out into the cool night air, the city stretched before her in shimmering lights and restless energy. The world didn't stop moving, not for anyone. She inhaled deeply, filling her lungs with the crisp air, letting it ground her for just a moment before she slid into the waiting black car parked at the curb. The driver, an older man with sharp eyes and a quiet presence, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Where to, Ms. Leavitt?" She didn't hesitate. "Midtown. Private event at the Sterling Club." He nodded, smoothly pulling the car into traffic. The city blurred past the tinted windows, but Karoline wasn't looking outside. She was already focused on what was next. The Sterling Club wasn't just another venue. It was an institution. The kind of place where deals were made over $1,000 bottles of wine, where favors were traded like currency, where the most powerful people in the city whispered their plans behind mahogany doors. And tonight, Karoline wasn't going there to socialize. She scrolled through her phone, checking the latest headlines. The article about her being kicked out of the restaurant had already gone viral. The comment sections were ablaze, some condemning the restaurant, others speculating about who was behind the decision. But what really caught her eye were the responses from politicians, journalists, and insiders who were suddenly interested in what had happened. She smirked. That was exactly what she wanted. Her phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID, a familiar name. She let it ring twice before answering. "Karoline," the voice on the other end said, smooth but laced with restrained urgency. "I assume you've seen the coverage." "I have," she replied, her tone carefully neutral. "We need to talk." "I'm listening." A pause. She could almost hear the gears turning in his head. "The restaurant didn't act alone. You know that." She had suspected as much. "Go on." "There were conversations, meetings. Some people wanted to send a message, make you a little less visible." Karoline's grip on her phone tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "Who?" Another pause. Then finally, "Nicholas wasn't the only one." Her pulse quickened. She had anticipated a pushback, but this wasn't just a power play from one man. This was coordinated. "I need names," she said. "I'll see what I can do," the voice on the other end replied. "But be careful. This is bigger than you think." "I know exactly how big it is," she said. "That's why I'm not stopping." She ended the call before he could say anything else. The car pulled up in front of the Sterling Club, its grand entrance lit by soft golden lights. A valet opened her door, and she stepped out, smoothing her blazer as she glanced up at the towering building. Inside, the atmosphere was as refined as ever, muted conversations, the clink of glasses, the hum of an expensive jazz quartet playing somewhere in the background. Karoline walked through the lavish room with the ease of someone who belonged, her presence turning heads, whispers trailing in her wake. She spotted them almost immediately. A cluster of men in tailored suits, gathered in the far corner, speaking, in low, measured tones. Nicholas was there, of course. And next to him, two other familiar faces, senators, media executives, men who had far too much influence in how narratives were shaped. Karoline didn't hesitate. She walked straight toward them. Nicholas noticed her first, his expression unreadable. The others followed his gaze, and just like that, their conversation stopped. "Gentlemen," she said smoothly, her voice carrying just enough edge to make them uncomfortable. "Mind if I join you?" For a moment, no one spoke. Then Nicholas, ever the composed strategist, gestured to an empty chair. "By all means." She sat down, crossing one leg over the other, and let a slow smile curve her lips. "Now," she said, resting her hands lightly on the table, "let's talk about what happens next." And just like that, the real game began.